Welcome. My name is Gene Reuter. I'm the Director of Practice Groups, also Vice President and General Counsel of the Federalist Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th Annual Executive Branch Review Conference. I want to thank you all for being here today. It's good to see a nice turnout to get us started this morning. We're expecting a record crowd at this conference. And for this 5th Annual Conference, we're going to use several panels and addresses on various aspects of the relationship between Congress and the executive branch. That's our focus today. And it's difficult to imagine a more relevant, timely topic, the intersection of Congress, the executive branch, the administrative state. For the Federalist Society itself, this conference represents something of a synthesis between our executive branch review project on the one hand and our Article 1 initiative on the other hand. You can learn more about both of those at the Federalist Society's website, fedsoc.org. It is my hope that by the end of the day, we will have solved any problems that might or might not exist in the executive branch, Congress, or the interaction between the two. But in the unlikely event we fail at that, we will continue on. One housekeeping item just before we begin. A quick show of hands, if you could. How many of you plan to stay through lunch today? Okay, keep your hands up if you brought your own lunch. That's a lot of people. Good. We're always pleased to welcome Senator Mike Lee to our Federalist Society programs. He is a lifetime student of the Constitution and a serious and learned advocate for the Constitution. He's also a longtime friend of the Federalist Society. In addition to having run the Federalist Society chapter at his law school, he's made numerous appearances and spent countless hours at Federalist Society events. He's been very generous with his time. Importantly for our purposes today, he's also launched an Article 1 project in the U.S. Senate out to study the role of Congress. Now, personally, I've always thought of Congress, of course, as the first branch. After all, it is Article 1. And if you think about the original geography of the capital city, basically a square, but situated as a diamond, 10-mile square on each side, carved out of Maryland and Virginia, although Virginia has since taken back its portion, the city's sectioned into quadrants. And precisely in the middle of those 4 quadrants, where the quadrants converge, is the Capitol building, home to Congress. It's the first and most central branch. Now, true enough, I'm sure the students here will remember that the Supreme Court was originally housed in the Capitol building, but it was relegated to the basement, and now it's in the backyard of Congress. And the president, of course, 16 blocks distant. So Congress really is central. Now, Senator Lee's Article 1 mission statement is short and succinct, and it's not called a mission statement, but I assume it is. And I think it's worth reading in its entirety, so I'm going to do that. But as I read through this, think about today's executive branch, and also think about the administrative state in particular. This is a quote from that website. The authors of the Constitution intended Congress to be first among the federal government's 3 co-equal branches, endowed with the power to legislate, tax, spend, and oversee the weaker executive and judicial branches, while simultaneously held to tighter public accountability. Congress was meant to be the driving force in federal policymaking. So our question today is whether Congress is meeting that goal. And you can find more information, of course, about Senator Lee's Article 1 project on the Senator's website. With that, please join me in welcoming Senator Mike Lee.
A couple of years ago, I mentioned in a speech that I had an experience with my 16-year-old sons several years ago, listening to the radio. This song came on the radio that we had heard many times before, and for whatever reason, I had never heard the words of the song. I had never listened closely to what the words were saying. I realized it was an awful song. I did what any God-fearing Christian father would do, and I'd seize the control knob, turn down the volume, and I said, guys, this is terrible language. We're not going to listen to this. And my son John, without batting an eye, said to me, Dad, it's not bad if you don't think about it. I've used that analogy countless times in thinking about what happens in Washington, D.C., but I had another experience with another one of my children just the other day, almost identical to this one. Different song, different child. This one was my now 16-year-old daughter, Eliza. Eliza's fantastic. She's routinely accused by her brothers as being my favorite, but, you know, I don't have favorites. It's just she really is awesome. We were driving down the street the other day, and we had a song playing in the car, and I don't think I had ever heard this song, and I don't ever want to hear it again, but it's just awful lyrics. The name of the song was Versace on the Floor, if you've heard it, and it was just dreadful. And I said, Eliza, we're not listening to this. This is a horrible, horrible song. And she said, Dad, but it's Bruno Mars. As if that were an answer, as if that somehow mattered, that somehow made it different. She thinks that's a legitimate argument. Now, up until this point, I've always thought Eliza had an outstanding legal mind, but I think she might be onto something in one simple sense. It does matter who's doing the speaking. Not necessarily in the way that Eliza thought, but who's doing the speaking matters in the law. And that's part of what we're here to talk about today. That's what I would like to direct my remarks to today. Thank you, by the way, for hosting this event and for asking me to participate. I'm very honored to be here. A little more than a year ago, I started an effort within Congress called the Article 1 Project, or the A1P, as we sometimes refer to it. It's an in-house, internal, bicameral think tank within Congress designed to get at this question of who is speaking when it comes to the law. The premise of the Article 1 Project is simple, and it goes back to the fact that over the last 80 years, Congress has gradually, steadily, but rather willfully abdicated its role as the lawmaking body within the federal government. And it does matter who's speaking when we make the law. This, by the way, has happened under Congresses, under Senates, and under White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination. I don't mean to say that both parties have done it in exactly the same way, but I will say that members of both parties have eagerly contributed to the problem. And the problem relates to excessive delegation of the lawmaking power. Not just a little bit of delegation, but a whole lot of delegation, to the point that one can scarcely recognize which branch of government is actually making the law. And in fact, if we're being fair, if we're being honest, we've got one branch that is making the most law by far, and it's not the legislative branch. To be sure, we're not the victims here. We in Congress are, in fact, the perpetrators, but I'll get more into that a little bit later. Article 1 of the Constitution states in no uncertain terms. In fact, it states this in the very first clause of the very first section of the first article of the Constitution, that all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. The framers of the Constitution understood really well that Congress would predominate over the other two branches of government. This was done quite by design, because they understood that Congress would be the branch of the federal government most accountable to the people and at the most regular intervals. That's why in Federalist 48, James Madison explained this point by saying, quote, "The legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex." I always enjoy it whenever the words impetuous and vortex can appear side by side like that. And yet I've found that they appear side by side nowhere other than Federalist 48. That's why I quote it whenever I get the chance. For the first 100 years or so of our republic, this basically worked. It was followed. In fact, it was followed instinctively. It was not something that Congress ever had much of a desire to depart from, because Congress was doing what most, at the time of the founding, expected Congress would do, jealously guarding its own power. So Congress made the laws, and the executive branch enforced the laws. That's how it worked. But then in the early part of the 20th century, as the so-called progressive theory of government gained traction, the strict separation of powers contemplated by the Constitution, and in fact prescribed by it, began to be undermined. By the time of his first inaugural address, President Franklin Roosevelt was able confidently and happily to announce that the Constitution should be changed. He announced that the Great Depression itself had created, quote, a set of circumstances that should be treated, quote, as we would treat the emergency of war, and that, quote, it may be that an unprecedented demand and need for undelayed action may call for a temporary departure from the normal balance of public procedure, close quote. Well, as it turns out, FDR's departure from the constitutional order would be anything but temporary. And the United States has been steadily departing from that normal balance ever since then. The other two branches of the federal government, the legislative branch and the judicial branch, didn't, at least initially, take this departure lying down. Subsequent Congresses were not as willing to give FDR's new radical view of how things would operate a blank check to create laws. And Roosevelt infamously had to threaten to pack the Supreme Court before the judicial branch came to an uneasy truce with this new type of constitutional arrangement. It wasn't until Roosevelt died and President Truman came to power that the government adopted a more systematic and codified framework that would set the ground rules for this new administrative state. The cornerstone of this framework, as you know, is the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act. In the years that followed the enactment of the APA, Congress granted agencies really broad lawmaking authority. And at the same time, in an effort to retain as much of its legislative power as possible, Congress began inserting more and more of these legislative veto provisions into its delegations of legislative power. This framework, of course, was not completely static over the next 40 years that followed from that. But in the 1980s, two Supreme Court cases came along that fundamentally changed the balance of power between the three branches of government. In 1983, when the Supreme Court decided INS v. Chadha, the court held that legislative veto provisions were unconstitutional because they amounted to a second legislative act. They amounted to a subsequent ringing of the legislative bell without following the prescription, the formula demanded by the Constitution in Article 1, Section 7, requiring bicameral enactment and presentment to the President. A year later, a year after Chadha in Chevron versus NRDC, the Supreme Court held that courts have to defer to an agency's own interpretation of ambiguous statutory text if that agency is charged with administering that law. Now, whatever one thinks about the legal merits of these two Supreme Court rulings, taken together, these two cases caused a substantial amount of power to be transferred from the legislative branch and the judicial branch over to the executive branch. And so if you imagine the balance of power being evenly distributed, at least evenly in the sense that power was being exercised only in proportion to the power that was granted by the Constitution, the executive branch at that point became even more lopsidedly large and powerful. Stripped of power to veto regulations issued by executive agencies, Congress lost one of its most powerful tools to control the very federal bureaucracies to which Congress had been delegating rather recklessly its lawmaking power. And in many cases, the courts could no longer question whether agency action exceeded the authority granted to it by the legislative branch. I want to be clear. It was, in fact, Congress and not the courts that did this. It is, in fact, Congress and not the courts that bears primary responsibility for what happened. After Chevron and after Chadha, we in Congress could have easily found new ways to exercise control over agencies. But over the years, we've chosen to outsource our constitutional lawmaking prerogatives because doing so is politically expedient. I say that because every lawmaker, after all, wants this to be the case. Every lawmaker, after all, wants credit for doing good things and wants none of the blame that goes along with it. We want credit for doing things like cleaning up the air or the water or having safe environments for workers or regulating how nuclear power plants will be operated. But coming up with the tedious details and engaging in the difficult line drawing process that involves actually making law in each of these areas is not only tedious and difficult, but it's also politically a little bit risky. So instead, members of Congress basically opt for the option that says we shall have good law in Area X, and we hereby delegate to commission or department or agency or Bureau Y the task of making good law in Area X. The results have been staggering. They have not been positive. The vast majority of federal laws are not passed by the House and the Senate and presented to the President. They instead take the form of regulations or orders written by people who do not stand for election and never will, and aren't really even accountable to anyone who does stand for election, at least not directly. The framers were in many ways ahead of their time, but they didn't envision that the great issues of the day would be debated exclusively during the notice and comment process, or that this notice and comment process would itself take the place as if supplanting the democratic process in a constitutional republic. The notice and comment process is, quite frankly, much more akin to a decree by a sovereign despot saying, prepare to be governed. You can tell us in advance the ways in which you might dislike what I'm going to do to you, but this is coming whether you like it or not. This upending of our constitutional order produces a lot of bad policy, and it contributes to the public's deep distrust of our governing institutions and of the public's skepticism and hopelessness about the direction of our government. As for conservatives, it represents something of a crisis. First, as conservatives, we believe in constitutionally limited government and in the rule of law. And we believe in those things as independent goods in and of themselves, as bulwarks of freedom in our society, and as things that make prosperity possible. The Federalist Society is itself founded on these principles and believes that these principles are goods in and of themselves. But second, the transfer of lawmaking power from Congress to the executive branch tilts the playing field, rigging the lawmaking process to benefit the wealthy and the well-connected at everyone else's expense. When elected representatives in Congress tie their own hands and empower unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats to make the law, it thwarts the kinds of policies that we as conservatives tend to advocate. Policies that will limit rather than expand the size and the scope and the reach of government and protect Americans from the many dangers of overreach. These things are hazardous. These things never bode well for us. I always like to point out that I keep a visual display of this inequity in my office. I keep, on the one hand, the statutes passed by Congress in the last year. It's usually just a few hundred, at most just a few thousand pages long. Usually it's a stack of papers about that high, if you use the small paper, double-sided. And then I have the Federal Register next to that. It's not a few inches tall. It's 11 feet tall, also with the thin paper, double-sided. Last year, 97,000 pages from the Federal Register. That's pretty staggering. So needless to say, measured by weight or volume or word count or economic cost, they almost outweigh us by every conceivable metric. This is where the Article I project comes in. Our goal is to develop and advance and ultimately enact an agenda of structural reforms that will strengthen Congress by reclaiming the legislative powers that have been ceded to the executive branch. And they really have been ceded. Sometimes when you hear members of Congress talk about this disparity between the Federal Register on the one hand and the number of laws passed by Congress on the other hand, if you hear them refer to it at all, they will frequently refer to it as if we in Congress were the victims. We are not, in fact, the victims. We are the perpetrators. We have done this willfully because it makes our job easier. It's a whole lot easier and less politically risky to have somebody else do the lawmaking than it is to do the lawmaking yourself, even when you're elected to do that very job, and even when you've sworn an oath under Article 6 of the Constitution to uphold that very document. At the core of our mission is restoring congressional authority over regulations and over regulators themselves. So I'm beyond pleased to see that the first panel this morning will discuss the basic but vital question: what is Congress doing to reassert its power over agencies? With respect to the esteemed lawyers who will be appearing on that panel, I'd like to take a shot at answering that question by highlighting 3 pieces of legislation that will begin the process of reinvigorating the separation of powers at the heart of our constitutional system. First, the REINS Act. REINS, of course, in this context stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. This is something that would help to restore the balance of power between the legislative and executive branches of government by requiring passage, bicameral passage and presentment to the President prior to any major rule taking effect. Major rule being defined by the OMB as something with an economic cost in excess of $100 million. That would require Congress to run it through the system, run it through the constitutional system. Under this law, the specialized know-how within each agency would still be allowed to contribute to the regulatory process. But ultimately, Congress would be responsible for every major regulation that went into effect. This would make it easier for American voters to know who to blame for bad policies. As things currently stand, lawmakers can have it both ways. So EPA promulgates a regulation dealing with some environmental issue, and we can tell our constituents that, of course, we support clean air and clean water. But we had no idea that the EPA was going to do it this way in such a costly manner. And we had no idea that EPA was going to promulgate regulations that, for example, set ozone levels below where Mother Nature herself has set them. I mean, true fact, there are parts of my state where Mother Nature is in open, flagrant violation of EPA regulations because she set the ozone levels too high. I'm pretty sure the framers would not approve of reducing this legislative process to a game of 3-card Monte. The REINS Act will fix this, where you'll know who, in fact, is making the law. Now, interestingly enough, the Constitution already requires this. The REINS Act is doing, in many ways, what the Constitution already requires. It's doing less of it because it applies only with respect to major rules. My hope is that eventually we can get it to the point where it would be all rules that have a binding effect on the public. But alas, we have to start with the government we have rather than the one we wish we had, the one we deserve, the one the Constitution already requires. An interesting thing about the REINS Act is that whenever you hear it criticized, many of the criticisms, especially those coming from members of Congress or those wanting for whatever reason to defend the status quo, will say, well, if we voted on all these, even if it were just the major rules as required by the REINS Act, Congress wouldn't possibly be able to keep up with all that. Congress couldn't cast that many votes. Well, in the first place, with the REINS Act, it wouldn't add that many. We're talking about a few dozen a year. We could certainly keep up with that. But even if it were scores, even if it were 100, even if it were hundreds of times a year we had to cast such a vote, that's what we do. We're there to vote on laws. And if Congress can't itself keep up with the volume of law being churned out through the executive branch agencies, something has gone terribly, dangerously wrong. Next, the Separation of Powers Restoration Act is a legislative proposal that's grown out of the Article 1 project that will functionally overturn the Chevron doctrine by reinstating federal judges' power, and indeed the obligation of federal judges to interpret federal statutes. Specifically, the bill amends the APA and requires judges who are hearing challenges to agency actions to review all relevant questions of law on a de novo basis. Now, this shouldn't be groundbreaking, but it is. It shouldn't be remarkable to say that judges should use their interpretive tools, apply the canons of statutory construction, to interpret these things the same way they would interpret a statute in any other circumstance. But it is. The bill would end the dysfunctional status quo that tilts the legal playing field in favor of the bureaucrats. If passed, the legislation would place federal law into the hands of legislators empowered to write and judges empowered to interpret, just as the Constitution contemplates. Finally, There's another piece of legislation called the Agency Accountability Act that has become a project of A1P that would make federal agencies accountable, again, by directing most fines, fees, and unappropriated proceeds to the Treasury, instead of letting federal agencies keep the money and then spend it as they see fit. You see, the Constitution has this pesky little provision that gives Congress, and exclusively Congress, the power and the responsibility to direct spending of federal dollars. The power of the purse is one of Congress's most potent tools for controlling bureaucracies, which is why so many agencies have sought to secure their own revenue streams, operating free from the scrutiny and accountability of congressional oversight. You see, when they can do this, they can take on yet another incident, yet another characteristic of a sovereign despot. They can bring in the money to do what they want, and then they can make the law, and then they can enforce that same law. And they become a closed-loop system, one in which accountability can be found nowhere. Passing the Agency Accountability Act would go a long way toward putting Congress, and by extension the American people, back in charge of the federal bureaucracies, and specifically the way they spend money. Many Americans now feel, and this shows up in polls all the time, that they're not in control of their own government. And we all know that's a very dangerous place to be. The perception is dangerous. The reality underlying that perception, or the lack of that perception in many circles, is really alarming. And this is that perception because this is a problem. The administrative state is designed to be insulated from politics. It's designed to be insulated from the will of the people. It sounded like a good idea when it was first instituted. I mean, I wasn't alive at the time, unlike a bunch of my colleagues in the Senate, who had already been here since the Grover-Cleveland administration. But at the time, insulating something from politics must have sounded like a great idea. After all, nobody likes politics. Politics is ugly. Politics is a nasty word. But what does politics mean in this context other than political accountability, other than following the will of the people through regular elections? This vast unaccountable morass of unaccountable agencies and commissions are things that tend to be captured by the powerful and well-connected, all dedicated to the regulation of the minutia of everyday life. But we can push back. If we're able to pass even one of these legislative proposals I've mentioned, the REINS Act, the Separation of Powers Restoration Act, or the Agency Accountability Act, then we will have made real progress toward listening to the people and toward making sure that our government itself has to listen to the people. And if we can do more, if we can pass all three bills, it'd constitute a fundamental, generational shift of power in this country, a shift of power back to the people, a transfer of power not merely from one party to another, but a transfer of power from Washington, D.C. back to the American people. You see, in recent decades, what has happened is this. Power has been taken away from the American people in two steps. First, away from the people at the state and local level to Washington, and then within Washington, from the people's own elected lawmakers to unaccountable, unelected bureaucrats. This has been really good for a small handful of people in Washington. I'm convinced it's one of the reasons why 6 of our nation's 10 wealthiest counties are now suburbs of Washington, D.C. A lovely region, to be sure, an area where I'm sure many, if not most of you, happen to reside. But it's an area that is not a banking hub. It's not the home to any vast store of natural resources. It's not a technological innovation hub. No, make no mistake, the money is here only because the power is here, concentrated in the hands of a few elites, and perpetuated by this system within our government that has taken the American people away from their own government. I'm very encouraged, all of that said, by the progress that we've made in the last year. And I'm especially encouraged that the Federalist Society and other organizations continue to hold events devoted to the proposition that our governing institutions should function in the way the Founding Fathers intended, in the way that text of the Constitution requires. What we do in Congress matters. Who speaks when the government tries to make law matters. Just as my daughter's homage to Bruno Mars had some relevance somewhere on a distant planet, this one really is true. Who speaks matters when it comes to making law. But what each of you do matters more. Restoring our constitutional republic will require structural shifts in our government and fundamental changes in our political culture. That's why events like this one today are so helpful, and that's why I thank you at the Federalist Society. Thank you very much.